Hi there, boys and girls. Today for story time, we're going to read Mr. Clumsy by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Clumsy is quite the opposite of Little Miss Neat, and you shall see why. It was a nice morning. The sun was shining, and the trees were full of singing birds. Everybody outside was awake and smiling, but in a run-down little house in the middle of the field, somebody was still asleep. Can you guess who it was? His alarm clock rang. Ring, 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 ring. Mr. Clumsy reached to turn off his alarm clock, and one touch, he knocked it on the floor. Oops, he said. That's the third alarm clock I've broken this week. As you might have guessed, Mr. Clumsy was a very clumsy fellow. He got out of bed and turned on the radio, but the knob came off in his hand. Oops, said Mr. Clumsy. That's the second radio I've broken this month. Mr. Clumsy went downstairs. He took a letter out of his mailbox and went to the kitchen to make some breakfast. I guess he must have turned the knob too hard. Mr. Clumsy took a slice of bread out of his bread basket and popped it into the toaster. Then he turned around to open his letter, but it wasn't on the table where he had left it. Can you guess where it was? It was in the toaster, browning very nicely. He didn't put the bread in the toaster, he put the letter in the toaster. Oh dear. Mr. Clumsy fished the letter out of the toaster. Ouch, he said, dropping it. It's hot. As he bent down to pick it up, he banged his head on the table and ended up head first in the bread basket. Mr. Clumsy is a very clumsy fellow. In fact, he's the clumsiest fellow in the whole world. Sounds like Mr. Bump. Later that morning, after he had managed to get the bread basket off his head, Mr. Clumsy went to town to shop. First things first, he said. He went into the bank to get some money. But then he tripped over the steps. Then he tripped into the bank. He knocked down the banker. You are, said the banker, my clumsiest client. Oops, said Mr. Clumsy. He needs to be more careful. But I think I see why he tripped. Do you notice his shoelaces untied? That will cause you to trip. Mr. Clumsy went to the butcher's shop. Morning, Mr. Butcher, he said cheerfully. Good morning, Mr. Clumsy, said the butcher. What can I get you for today? I'll take some of those right there, said Mr. Clumsy. He pointed to some nice fat sausages. But being Mr. Clumsy, he managed to trip and ended up with a sausage necklace. Mr. Clumsy's next stop was at the supermarket. Just inside the door was a huge pile of canned soup. Exclaimed Mr. Clumsy. Soup would be perfect for supper tonight. But can you guess what happened next? I bet you can. Did Mr. Clumsy pick a can from the top of the pile? Oh no, not Mr. Clumsy. Cans went flying and falling everywhere. Oops, he cried. Oh dear. You don't take one from the bottom. On his way home, Mr. Clumsy called on Farmer Brown for some fresh eggs. He smiled at the farmer and walked over to shake his hand. But being Mr. Clumsy, he managed to trip and fall, bringing down Farmer Brown with him. Splash! Oops, said Mr. Clumsy as they landed in the duck pond. Next time, said Farmer Brown, sitting in the duck pond, why don't you let me deliver your eggs to you? Why, thank you very much, replied Mr. Clumsy. Don't mention it, muttered the soggy Farmer Brown. Mr. Clumsy went home, drying off as he walked. First things first, he said, and he went to take his bath. But as soon as he stepped in the tub, he slipped on the soap. He did 2 flips and ended up with his head in the clothes hamper. Whoops, said a muffled voice of Mr. Clumsy. Later, he managed to get downstairs for supper. Soup from the supermarket, sausages from the butcher's shop, and eggs from the farmer. Or, should I say, soup from the saucepan that had boiled over, and sausages from the frying pan that had caught fire, and eggs, very, very, very scrambled eggs. Delicious, he said, leaning back in his chair. What happens when you lean back in your chair? Sometimes... Crash! Oops, said Mr. Clumsy. Then Mr. Clumsy decided to go to bed. He leaned over to turn off the lamp beside his bed, and... Oops. The end. Mr. Clumsy. Try to be more careful. Don't be Mr. Clumsy. Hope you enjoyed the story. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.